Now, when we're talking about hi-fi, definitely the same with every single hobby. There's going to be different categories, and mainly it's all determined by the price. We have entry, we have mids, we have highs, and currently we have the Summit Fi. And for this thing right here, the DITA Project M is $325 US. Does this thing actually perform well and actually stand out from the rest? Let's talk about it. As always, just want to say this before we continue. Thank you, Carson, for sending these pair my way so that I could give you guys my honest opinions about this IEM. The Project M is from DITA, which is a company based in Singapore. And the first time that I heard about them is the DITA Perpetua, which I still haven't heard it, but I definitely heard some good things about it. Now, when we're talking about DITA, usually we associate them with some form of like aluminum head shell, metal head shell, you get my idea. But this one right here, it catches everybody's eyes, mainly because of its super clear resin design that looks so sleek, that looks so clean. Honestly, this thing just looks like an art piece in itself. But before we go into that, y'all know my shtick. Unboxing time. And let me just say this right here, the box is also being done quite immaculately. For $300 US, you're definitely getting a very nice presentation with the Project M with silver inlays in front of here, as well as you can see there is a graph, there's a frequency response of the DITA Project M. Behind it is literally just some specs talking about its drivers, which is a 1BM 1DD config, its dynamic driver, you know, the impedance, so on and so forth. So sliding this off, you'll be reviewed with a box, but not just any box. This thing right here, DITA actually took a lot of consideration to the packaging. Like this is a cloth finish box. Like, honestly, this feels very, very amazing. Opening this up, you'll be greeted with, you know, the usual pamphlets that you get, a warranty, which, if I'm not mistaken, I think they mentioned something along the lines of like 10 years warranty, which is crazy. And also you'll be greeted with 3 things: the head shells, which I've removed, the case, which is, if I'm not mistaken, it's from like a custom company. Yeah, it's from a custom company in Germany. As itself, I will comment on this first. It looks very amazing. It looks very different and unique from almost everything from the market. But at the same time, I do not feel like it's practical to be used. Mainly because when you are storing the DITA, you might actually crimp on the cables when you are closing it up. That's my only gripe about it. And honestly, there's also one very weird thing where, since the DITA is actually quite a little bit bulky in terms of its head shell, you might actually need to angle it perfectly just so that you could close it. So I consider this more of a novelty item, but still it looks quite amazing and, you know, quite eye-catching for DITA at least. And finally, you will be getting 5 pairs of tips from DITA, courtesy of collaboration with Final Audio, as you can see right here. And in regards to cable, you are getting a cable that is made by Cardus Audio, which honestly, just by the feeling itself, like this thing, even though it's just a 2-core, it feels very premium. It has that sort of a soft matte texture to it, which, you know, it doesn't really feel like it doesn't really feel cheap. That's all I'm gonna say. This thing also doesn't really have any microphonics at all, which is a plus for us. And also definitely with the trend of modularity jacks, you will have Cardus's own rendition of their modular jack, which you can see in the B-roll right here. This is how they change it. You just unscrew it and just plug out and plug in, and there is like a small indent for you to, you know, align your tips. But anyways, moving on. I don't think I need to talk about the build anymore because, you know, just looking at this alone, y'all probably know that this thing just looks amazing. It looks like a piece of art. And in terms of the fit, how does this thing fit? In my personal opinion, I feel like this thing fits very snugly, very perfectly in my ears using the M tips from Final Audio. Nothing really much I want to say, but if there's one thing that I want to comment on, it might be the nozzle, because this thing has a sort of a wide nozzle, slightly discomforting if you're wearing it for hours, because me, after listening to a whole album of vinyl, it starts to get a little bit noticeable, like, you know, that thing's actually pushing into my ear canals. But, you know, that's beside the point, because seal wise, fit wise, everything is perfect. But anyways, moving on to the main part of the video, where, you know, that's why most of y'all clicked on. How does it sound like? How does the Project M sound like? Well, this is the graph. Hopefully this thing is in focus. Yes, it is. And you can see that in general, this thing is sort of a balanced tuning with very specific emphasis on the treble and emphasis on the sub bass. I do not want to talk about what source I use because I used multiple sources, mainly because this thing is very picky on sources and it scales very well with gear. On the M15, the treble might be a little bit too much for me. On the RU6, bass sounds very amazing. On the SMSL SH6, everything sounds expansive, but with the little caveat of the fuzziness of this amp, making the treble a little bit more pleasing, relaxing, but less resolving. And last but not least, directly plugging it into my MacBook just for the sake of, like, you know, if I'm driving this without any DACs, how will it fare? But regardless of what I say right now, I think in a general sense, for the low end starting off with the bass, everything sounds more or less the same in terms of its technical ability. Generally, the Project M is not a bass heavy pair. You would notice that, again, it is very focused on the sub bass. It wants you to know that this thing has sub bass, and it gets progressively leaner as you go on to the lower bass to the mid bass. Sub bass in general, in my opinion, has a very silky, smooth texture, and it is adequately dispersed. Like when that thing rumbles, you don't feel like it's in a monotonous place, but it's actually very equal. But still, I feel like there's some weird issue where once I listen to this, it has a little bit of a congestion at the end of every sub bass note. It feels like it doesn't have enough space, some outlet for it to effectively disperse out. So it sounds slightly bloated, but I think that's probably just me being very nitpicky. Generally, when you're just tuning in, you're not critically listening to every single track that you're testing on. I think that's more than fine. Bass notes on the lower end, like I mentioned, it's a little bit more lean, but when you're talking about its note definition, when you're talking about its prowess, it definitely sounds natural. It definitely sounds a little bit bouncy, but it's on the fun side, I would say. And I would definitely prefer this than the more quicker, more transient bass where, you know, things are very tight. This thing is tight, but it has that sort of an overtone after the bass, after the notes, that makes it feel more natural, if you will. And when I was starting off, I was testing this mainly using Mac Miller's Swimming album, which is the one album that I am very familiar with. Overall, 808s sound perfect. Overall, all of the bass notes sound good. Overall, drums all are very mature to it. It sounds natural enough. It doesn't sound too thumpy. It sounds just alright overall. But anyways, moving on to the mids. Now, in terms of the vocals, definitely you feel like everything is being centered quite forward and quite perfectly. But I feel like when you're talking about vocals, using the M15 or using the MacBook directly, I feel like everything is a little bit more thin, a little bit more dry, maybe slightly hollowish on the female vocals, and maybe just lacking in body and overall. But when you're using something else, sort of like an RU6, definitely there's more body, there's more structure to the vocals, and less cold sounding. Definitely when you're using something warm, the crispiness will reduce, that's for sure. And oh yeah, backtracking a little bit on the bass, using the RU6 on the Project M is definitely, I would say, sort of a good thing for the bass part. It definitely makes everything sound a little bit more full. I could see people enjoying that for sure. As a balance pair, I prefer this bass as it is. If you feel like you need more, just use the RU6. And if you're okay with that, definitely it will give you even more on the mids, mainly on the vocals. But even without using the RU6, even without using any of these, if we're just directly plugging it into my Mac, the instruments sound good. Things sound very crisp, things sound very clear, very transparent, very smooth. And due to the fact that it has very good technicalities, I am actually hearing a lot of micro details that I never even noticed in my Mac Miller Swimming album, which I have listened to it countless of times. That's probably my most played album, so that's what I'm gonna say. Going on to the treble, I'm guessing this is maybe because of the fact that they're using the BA. It sounds airy, but maybe it's a little bit on the lighter side, a little bit on the thinner side. Like, I don't know how to say this, but like when we're talking about details on the upper mids of the treble, usually they shine and they have some form of extension. This thing has that as well, but it has sort of a more light-ish sound to it. Like the timbre is more light. Nevertheless, this is more like a character for this IEM rather than, you know, a flaw. So if you like those type of slightly lighter-ish treble overtone, overall again, treble is very clean, very crispy. It might be too much for me sometimes if we're using the M15, and I specifically want to mention this if I am using the M15. But on the SMSL SH6, on the RU6, or directly on the Mac, everything is alright. That just gives us a conclusion that this thing is quite source sensitive. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's just finish off with the treble. I did not finish anything about the treble. I actually forgot to mention a lot of things in regards to this site. So, you know, I'm just gonna talk about this post editing. Upper mids and up. Everything in general is quite crispy. Everything is quite sharp, to say the least. If we're being honest, sometimes the treble might be a little bit too unbearable. Hence, even using the Mac alone, it is slightly sharp in some degrees. For me, as a treble detail whore, I feel like it's still acceptable, but if I'm using this, scaling it off on an M15, definitely I'm gonna be like, you know, very fatigued. But with anything that has a color that's not treble emphasized, something along the lines of the Cayenne RU6, which is an R2R type of sound, SMSL SH6, which in general, from my experience, any standalone amps will have a more expansive and immersive feeling to it and a wider field of view. It will definitely attenuate down all of those harshness, all of those crispiness to it. So in general, it is very source sensitive. Depending on how you want to play with it, it's gonna, you know, make or break your experience. Hi-hats and rides, all of those sound good. The overtones might be a little bit anorexic, if it makes any sense. Like, imagine instead of like hitting a hi-hat, you can feel like the overtones are dispersing. This thing is like kind of mono, if it makes any sense. And I guess guitar shreds are quite bright, a little bit on the colder side, but everything is good. Back to the video. In terms of the technicalities, dynamics in general, I would say it's good, but doesn't really scale that well when you go a little bit high. You can feel like instruments in general are very nice, but the vocals for some reason are still a little bit underwhelming for me. One thing that's not underwhelming for me is the soundstage. For $325 US, this thing definitely sounds wider than the majority of what I've heard so far in this price category. It has enough width, it has enough depth. Height may be average, but definitely we're mainly talking about width and depth. Everything is far, everything is wide enough so that it doesn't feel congested at all. So I like that. And again, imaging, due to the fact that it is from a very wide soundstage, it definitely feeds into it, aiding it, making it even better. And in terms of last but not least, detail retrieval, I feel like this thing definitely takes the cake for very good detail retrieval. I said it, I found new things that I didn't even notice on the Mac Miller album, so take that as you will. But anyways, just wrapping this up real quick, the Project M, in my opinion, is quite an interesting pair, mainly because it is quite an unconventional tuning where I think most people don't really appreciate this that much, because when you are listening to things this long, for me it's only 2 years and I don't consider myself veteran or anything at that point, but I believe that my taste in music has matured, and instead of focusing on general V-shapes, which is more fun and dynamic, you tend to focus more on things that are more analytical, things that are more technical. And I would say that this pair in itself is very technical. The tuning is very mature, if I could put it that way. I believe that for people, once they have actually listened enough, this type of tuning would naturally gravitate towards them. Other than an M15 source, which is not really that ideal, I feel like if you're using something that's a little bit more warm, a little bit more colored, this thing will sound great. And with all that being said, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.